Welcome to EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. I'm your host, Russ Roberts of Stanford University's Hoover Institution. Our website is econtalk.org, where you can subscribe, comment on this podcast, and find links and other information related to today's conversation. You'll also find our archives, where you can listen to every episode we've ever done going back to 2006. Our email address is mail@econtalk.org. We'd love to hear from you. Today is January 8th, 2015, and I want to remind listeners, please go to econtalk.org. In the upper left-hand corner, you'll find a link to a survey where you can vote for your favorite episodes of 2014. Now for today's guest, Nassim Nicholas Taleb. His books include Anti-Fragile, The Black Swan, and Fooled by Randomness. And today we're going to be talking about a recent paper of his, co-authored with Rupert Reed, Raphael Douadi, Joseph Norman, and Yanir Bar-Yam on the precautionary principle, its application to genetically modified organisms, and other general issues related to risk and ruin. Nassim, welcome back to EconTalk.
Hi, I'm always honored to be on your show, but I also have to admit it's a pleasure having a conversation with you. Perhaps we think too much alike, and it may be a problem, from a scientific standpoint, but it's always a pleasure.
Well, it looks like two data points. It may only be one. That's correct. Let's start. What is the precautionary principle, and why is it important?
Okay. There's some water on the floor. Okay? Right on the floor. Do you drink from it? Would you drink from it? No. We're sort of wired to not drink from a little bit of water on the floor. If you're thirsty, you're very careful. But you have no evidence that it's poisonous. Aha. So you're making a decision without evidence. This is the exercise of the precautionary principle in your daily life. In other words, for things for which you don't have evidence, you sort of try to stay cautious until you accumulate evidence. Then you can take the risk.
So you're talking, it's useful in situations where you call it non-evidentiary problems.
So technically, the definition of the precautionary principle is on decision making, what should be accepted or rejected in situations for which you do not have enough evidence, or you do not have evidence yet. In other words, scientific knowledge has not been sufficient in establishing a clear-cut answer about things, like what you exercise in daily life. 99% of things we do are based on precautionary principles in our daily lives. But there's something much deeper there, is that as people are getting more and more into techniques of risk management, they tend to forget that most of the risks we are taking are of non-evidentiary nature, in the sense that the evidence comes always too late. And this is what we're trying to avoid. This is a very general concept that people know, have always understood in history, in decision-making. But the problem of what we call scientism, in a Hayekian sense, Hayekian Popperian sense, scientism, this idea of using mechanistic tools from science to make, claims and techniques. Scientism has blinded people to, this form of reasoning that is effectively more rigorous than science, because, you have an asymmetry. You may die if you're wrong, and if you're right, the payoff may be very small.
And you argue very thoughtfully in the paper that experts are important, but you have to pick the right kind.
Very, very often, people in a given profession develop expertise about what they're doing. And in most domains, they don't quite have a grasp of the risks, simply because your knowledge, professional knowledge, may, help you do a lot of things, but particularly if it's academic, it's not going to help you understand the risks. This we've seen in many domains. Like traders understand the risk because they're pretty much risk managers, built to be risk managers. But people that we encounter, quants, for example, they understand the return because they don't understand the risk of something. But what they don't understand is typically that the risk belongs to a completely different category. In other words, the tail risk, the risk of ruin, is very different from knowledge. So, for example, your risk can increase while your knowledge is increasing. And we have shown in the paper and in some derivations elsewhere how, for example, sometimes you bring something new, a new technique for which you understand the benefits are going to be great. And what you do is you increase both the benefits and the risk of ruin. So you end up worse off than you started, sometimes trying to cure a problem with another one. Is this clear enough, or should I?
So, well, I think
yes, go ahead.
I think I think we talked about this in a previous episode. You have to make a distinction between the process and the consequences of the process, right? So I think
exactly. So for some people, for example, I've noticed that in biology, they understand biology. Okay, they understand very well what they do in biology. And science is not about making claims about risk. Science is about making some verifiable and generalizable claims from a given process, and that someone else can read and continue, and so you're improving on a body of things. But it doesn't make claims about risk. So we noticed that neurobiologists, or biologists in general, but particularly because this thing was done on neurobiologists, but quite general to that profession, and to the broad field, they understand what they're doing, but their claims of evidence are usually more than 53% of the time in that experiment, in that paper. We've seen that they get things wrong when they're making the claim statistically. So a statistician can be ranked one step higher than a neurobiologist in a scientific claim. And the error is common, is, for example, the testing whether A is better than B. They test the significance of A and the significance of B, and without testing the significance of the difference between A and B. It may be technical for the common person, but it's a no-no in statistics. And yet more than half of papers in top journals in neurobiology make that mistake.
Yeah, it's a great point.
So they say the statistician, and effectively the way these people operate is they know biology a lot, but there's a cop called a statistician on top of them who studies the paper and puts a stamp on it, and typically runs the data himself, or let him run the data on SPSS or something, and then gives its approval. So knowing biology doesn't mean you understand the evidence, okay? And this is quite good. Now, one step higher up is that understanding statistical evidence doesn't mean you understand statistical risk. So let's see how. Many people we have discussed the GMO problem. Without going into details of GMO now, just as soon as any kind of statement about some kind of technology that may improve life for masses of people. Okay, so many of these people think that they have evidence. Okay, and then you read their papers and you look at it, and no statistician would ever let you say, I have evidence that. This is, again, the black swan problem. A statistician would only let you say, I fail to reject the null at X% confidence. This is what we brought up, all of us doing in our lives, no?
Right.
But they think so. So here you see that the statistical evidence, or what we call the mechanism, doesn't say anything about the tail.
Well, that's the
Claim
distinction.
outside the tail. Statistics is what happened within that band, and we have enough data to make that claim that this works. But it doesn't say anything about the what happens if that claim is wrong. And they give you themselves. They say, okay, there's 1% probability, or 2% probability, or 5% probability of that claim being wrong. But what happens when it's wrong is usually a different business. And that's where risk management starts. And that's my profession.
And of course, therefore, Nassim is the expert of experts. You have to be careful. It is a comforting thought for you, maybe not for us.
No. But I'm not an expert on expert. Our job is the left tail. which is a subspecialty.
Yeah, that's true.
But so when it comes to right tail or benefits and stuff like that, understanding process, body of the distribution, we have no, specialty, or we may understand some things, but we don't rank higher. So now that I gave you a hierarchy, I say neurobiologist, and you have on top of neurobiologist, you have the statistician saying whether the claims meet statistical evidence or not, and then higher than it, you have the left tail. And it's a complete different business that we have discussed together. Now, one simple analogy of why you need, why people sometimes in the profession are not qualified to talk about the risk of the profession is what we call the Carpenter Fallacy. If you want to understand the risk of ruin for a sequence of bets, okay, it's a standard resultant probability. But who would you go to for that problem? Would you go to a carpenter who builds the roulette, or would you go to a probability person? But a carpenter may claim, hey, you know what? You're insulting me. I know very well how this is built and stuff like that. But his knowledge of the carpentry involved in building the roulette table doesn't allow him to make claims as to the probability distribution of what's going to happen, and then less even about claims, concerning large deviations, the long sequences of tail events. You see my point?
I do.
So we have right. So this is this is where we're positioning that precautionary principle is by saying that there are some people who are in the business of that very left tail, who are in a different, completely different. Operate in a different science than yours. Science never really talks about left tails. Only journalists think science talk about that, or bad scientists. Okay, and then you need a cop for that. That's it.
So the way I think about it, that I learned from your paper, is really a distinction between harm and ruin. Exactly. So in one world, you play poker every night, and some nights you lose $1, some nights you make $1, some nights you might lose $5. But if you're in a neighborhood poker game, you're not going to lose your entire wealth. You're not going to have ruin. But you're dealing with cases, you're making a crucial distinction between harm, which is that some nights I might lose a little money, versus being wiped out. In the case of the globe, talking about extinction.
Exactly. So what happened is that, to frame it with, then the discussion of the three layers of knowledge, from the biologist to the statistician to the risk analyst, the body of the distribution is typically the job of the statistician. Variations, all these things. It's not our job. Our job is ruin. It's complete different dynamics. And for many probability distribution, there's a complete decoupling between variation and ruin. You remember when I published The Black Swan, it was in April 2007. If I received the Mexican peso for every time someone mentioned the great moderation to me, that the world is becoming a lot safer because it's less volatile. See, I would probably own a big strip of land in northern Mexico. You see. And then of course, sure, the crisis happened, and it was not a change of regime. It was nothing. It was just that they're making claims concerning tail events from observation of the body distribution, and for a class distribution that we're used to work with fat tails, these claims cannot be made at all. You see, so the risk can increase while at the same time variation can get smaller. And this is where Bernanke went wrong, because he was not trained enough in statistical, in fat tails to make, to understand the risk. Another ethical problem. Let me steal here now. Let me steal a metaphor that you gave me. Actually, I've used it before, and I gave you credit the first couple of times, then I stopped giving you credit. So maybe, so I owe it to your listeners. Is I learned from you something. Is that you remember when we were talking about the difference between a systemic and fat tail systemic event and a and a catastrophe, a small-time catastrophe, is that if a plane crashes, it's a tragedy because it will kill the people on a plane, and it's a great loss. Very bad news. But a plane crash will not kill every single person who ever took a plane before. Whereas in some domains, such as finance, for example, banks can lose in a single quarter every single penny they ever made before. So in fat tail domain, you have to be very careful because the tail is absorbing. It's a lot worse, but that's only money. It's a lot worse when we talk about the environment. Vastly worse because this is not renewable. Go ahead, sorry.
No, so talk about the underlying processes. I mean, it's a little bit puzzling to an amateur as to why fat tails are so important. So, for example, if I have thin tails, well, it just means that ruin is just very unlikely. So it's still possible, though. So why are fat tails important?
Fat tails are important because number one, you don't notice the variations, as I said, are compressed, so you don't notice that the risk is present. They are in the thin tail domain. Evidence can accumulate as to riskiness of something. If you go to Las Vegas and observe for 3 days, you pretty much understand everything. You can predict anything that can happen. You see, because the thin tails are so tractable, and the law of large numbers operates very quickly. For fat tails, you need a lot more data to know what's going on. And when an event happens, it can hit you big time. And the consequences of the event can be monstrous. So, which is why we cannot be casual about fat tail domains. Now, we can ex ante figure out if something is fat tails. We know the ecology is rather fat tail. But the crises in an ecosystem are not systemic because we have isolations. We do not have a large-scale generalized, or we did not have that before GMOs, which is why I'm worried about GMOs.
Well, the example you give, I think, that makes that so clear is a forest fire. A forest fire is extremely destructive, but there are all these natural built-in barriers. There's oceans, there's rivers, there's mountains, there's natural fire breaks that keep a fire from being a catastrophic event. But what you're worried about is something that has the potential to cross those barriers.
Exactly. So the way we say that nature has not blown up, or at least it's a history of a process. We have zillions of variations, trillions and trillions of variations, and on Mother Earth, and it didn't produce some tail events, but not pronounced enough to cause extinction. So even if we adjust by what we call the survivorship bias or some similar principle, we just can make claims that nature seems to have survived thanks to a mechanism by which catastrophes stay relatively local. So things don't spread. So in other words, the plane crashes but doesn't kill every single passenger, on other planes or those who ever took a plane before. You see, things stay confined and isolated. We had that in economic life, of course, until globalization, and you saw what happened. The crises now took place on the planet in 2008, and there's no place to hide, or almost no place to hide. And the ecology is going to be worse. We used to have an island separation, an early island barrier, which produced effectively some amount of diversity, because diversity is much higher per square meter on an island than it is on a continent. And we're losing it, and we're losing it through a lot of methods. But we'll come back to that in a minute. Now I have one other element of fat tails I want to add so we can inform the rest of the conversation, which is as follows. Many people understand that there's a risk of ruin, and it could be very small, and hey, sometimes you got to take it, you see. Many people understand that. But few understand that risk needs to be zero, not small. Why? Because think of what happens in a sequence of risk-taking. If you take a risk, say with a Russian roulette, a risk of ruin, and survive, what would you do next? hey, you may take it again. So many risks that are very, very small, because you've survived them, lead to 100% risk of ruin.
Right, because you get, well, it's the, there's a couple of things we've talked about before. I find that extremely powerful, which is what you call the turkey problem, which I got from Bertrand Russell, that every day the turkey is being taken care of by the farmer and thinking every day gets additional and new evidence that it's safe. It's fine. He's got a good life until Thanksgiving comes and he's killed. And similarly, value at risk in the financial crisis, it's working. It's fine. We're making profits every quarter. We're very prudent. We're very careful because we have this tool that we use. And I may have mentioned this before. By a friend who is skeptical of your work. I won't name him on the show, but he says to me, "Oh, everybody knows value at risk is dangerous." I said, "Well, it's true, but in theory, but after a while, if you keep using it, you probably get lulled into if you're not careful, and if you don't have other feedback loops that make you wary, you are very likely to start thinking, I've got this licked. So you fire the Russian roulette. The bullet doesn't kill you because it's got 1,000 chambers or maybe 100,000. But if you live for 40 years, you're in trouble."
Yeah, exactly. So this is what people fail to get, that ruin is not a renewable resource except in insurance. You see?
Explain.
Let me explain. If I play Russian roulette, if I play things like that, I'm not, the probabilities add up. So, the people, the mountain climbers, have a very small probability of dying in any given, episode. But what happens? Hey, they survive. So they're going to be tempted to do it again. So eventually the life expectancy is going to be much shorter, simply because they do a lot of episodes. Yeah. So the under repetition, and you end up with 100% guaranteed ruin. So you lose. It's a resource that's not renewable, and people fail to look at the risk that way. It's that you look at risk of one episode, not succession of tail risk taken by the planet. So I have no problem people taking risks so long as everyone stays local, not it doesn't threaten the whole human race.
And you mentioned insurance because it's like the cat having 9 lives. I get another.
No, because insurance you have a cash flow. So the idea for insurance, and they understand the problem very well, since Kramer, the guys who studied insurance, they looked at some process that compensates the risk you're taking, because you're making some money to accumulate in some reservoir that's going to be depleted but not 100%. So the idea is to calibrate your risk taking to what you're getting into the reservoir. In insurance, you can do that. In ecology, in many domains, you cannot do that, because the reservoir is not being filled. We're just wasting risk, you see. So what happens in the end, risk accumulates to 100% probability of ruin.
So let me ask one more general question, then we'll turn to GMOs and environmental issues more generally. So in the book, in the article, you talk about a contrast between bottom-up local events leading to thin tails, whereas global connected top-down events are going to be fat-tailed. Talk about that.
The best way I'm going to talk about, before getting to the statistical taxonomy of these things, is through a common, probably your next best economist. Who's your next best economist after Adam Smith?
That would be F.A. Hayek.
Yeah, there we go. So let's talk about Hayek. You see, I by now I can read you.
I got nervous. I got nervous there for a minute, but I got the right answer. I'm relieved.
What was the idea of Hayek? Why did Hayek want distributed knowledge in society? No monopoly of knowledge by anyone. Okay, because he wants the errors to be distributed. Because he thinks that the system knows more than any individual in part of the system. And also because he thinks we cannot forecast, the mind cannot foresee its own advance. That's another profundity. It's not just we can't forecast how we're going to forecast in the future. So really, let's call it Popper Hayek, because they really worked on that together, and the two friends were brilliant in slightly different domains. But so Hayek was against what? against a top-down social planner who thinks he knows things in advance, can foresee results, and makes, because the person, first of all has arrogant claim that may harm us, but also because his mistakes, he's not going to see his own mistakes, and mistakes would be large. So you see where I'm coming from?
Yep. It's Adam Smith's man of system also, same problem.
So now let's continue in Hayekian thought. We had, and let's see, this led Hayek to stand against what he calls scientism. Scientism is an unscientific use of science, and I've encountered with pro-GMO people who keep attacking me the scientism, because they say, "Oh, I'm for science." Okay, risk management is science fiction, and then there's no point. They're not even wrong. Hayek has solved that problem of scientism and false claims of 50, 60 years ago. And he effectively, as a man, was vindicated. There's something even more interesting than that about Hayekianism. The opposite of Hayek, people who did exactly what he was against were the Soviets, no?
Yeah.
Now, it so happened that there's a branch of mathematics largely developed by the Soviets in dynamical system. Arnold and just got the Abel Prize in that tradition, started by the Soviets in the Soviet Union in the heyday of Soviet science, about nonlinear dynamics. And the last one was a billiard ball fellow, Yakov Sinai, who got the Abel Prize. And he probably, the most crowned mathematician alive today. Now, what did the Soviet mathematicians say? Hey, you know what? In a complex system, you can't predict. That's sort of what they said, okay? Financed by whom? By the social planner.
Yeah, that's ironic.
So, and nobody saw the contradiction, right? Nobody saw the contradiction that if they're right, then they should have no Soviet system. So, but I'm telling you, it's ironic, but let's not laugh too early, because it looks like many people are making that mistake.
Well, it's a common problem. I argue that
making it in different, when you switch domains, so the fact is the mistake isn't the mistake of thinking that an environment is predictable when it's not. It's a mistake of not realizing that an idea developed in one domain, okay, can apply to another one, while accepting that these two domains have same operating mechanisms. You see, it's that, if we continue, Hayek effectively looked at nature as a format by which things, he sort of thought of nature directly and indirectly, and thought of the organic directly or indirectly as operating according to his principle of distributed knowledge and technologies and tinkering, away from that central planning mode.
And that's why the latest paper on macroeconomics that claims that such and such an intervention is good for the economy or bad for the economy is the same as the epidemiologist who claims that drinking coffee or wine or whatever it is good or bad for you. And they find some data.
I would say it's benign. It's benign to say drinking coffee is good or bad for you. It is a benign claim, and some such claim can be rigorous. But let's say now, who's a Soviet planner when it comes to nature? Aha, GMOs. Do you see where I'm coming from?
Well, let's talk about that. So
GMOs. So if you look at evolution, okay, if you look at how we get from things get from point A to point B, is by small tinkering, where mistakes are kept small and local. And you cannot foresee interaction in a given complex system unless you experiment with it. And that's Hayek. That's the mathematics that we have behind it. It's an entire class of mathematics about. Yeah. I don't know about Schumpeter, but I know about the real mathematicians who have worked on these problems and dynamical systems. Really, you cannot really forecast interactions between systems. They're too complex. And you can explain it to someone, say, to explain limits with all kind of incompleteness theorems we have, or with simple example of billiard balls. Okay, so the problem is that the natural systems, this is universality of complex system, have opacity if you look at them from the standpoint of a social planner, but they're very understandable if we look at them from a perspective of a complex system that has evolutionary attributes. So what you do is time counts a lot. You put things together, let them interact, and then there's some dynamics of interaction. And you'll see if the system doesn't blow up, okay, then it's a good system. If it blows up, then it's a bad system. And the system would anyway clean itself automatically using these mechanisms, okay, and it's just small tinkering.
Feedback loops.
Sorry, it was feedback loops between things, okay? In anti-fragile, you look at, I presented it in terms of different layers. You have a fragile layer at the bottom, like your cells, and then you have, hierarchy. You have above the cells, then you have individuals, and then you have societies, and then you have families, and then societies, and so on. And then humanity, and then you have species and stuff like that. So you have hierarchies. And then you have, of course, evolutionary mechanisms at all levels of the hierarchies. So this is how things work in nature. And most, I'm not saying anything that's not true for evolutionary biologists. But that process of tinkering is accepted, okay? Now, and that was bricolage, actually. The word tinkering I'm using now comes from bricolage, from the famous Monod and Jacob paper, the two French people who got the Nobel in the 60s. Now, when we look at GMOs, what are we doing with GMOs? We're skipping steps. A tomato, okay, there's a GMO tomato may, according to the FDA, be the same as a tomato that was obtained organically through natural mechanisms or human breeding even. But these steps are not the same as skipping zillions of steps to get to a tomato, you see. We don't know in the soil what's going to do to other plants. We don't know what's going to do to you. We have a lot of unknowns. So when you have a lot of unknowns like that, you put the precautionary principle until further notice. So that's what we're doing.
And I interviewed Greg Page, who's the former CEO of Cargill, and he accepts the idea that there may be some risks, but he, as you would argue, doesn't think much about ruin. So his view, and I think the view of many people in the industry, and certainly many scientists, whether they're tainted by self-interest or not, they would say, well, look, people are eating these new tomatoes that have, say, the gene of a fish in it, or whatever has been done to it, and they're not dying. And it's hard to understand why you would be worried about the fact that there's going to be, say, a mass extinction of human beings from eating a GMO-modified tomato. So what's the scientific evidence?
No, that's exactly what we don't want to avoid, have to talk about scientific evidence when the burden of the proof is on the GMO people to show us that they understand anything remotely about their tail risk, which they don't. The tail risk is not someone dying from eating a tomato. That's not a big risk. No, that's not a systemic risk. The big risk is what can happen when you have two things going together, which is what happened with the Soviet style is a combination of monopoly of some plants over others. There's too large a system. And, of course, creation of other species, that will themselves be also too powerful. And then they may kill the GMOs, or one may kill the other. And you may have huge imbalances in nature. And these imbalances in nature can produce large deviations. This is our point. And we haven't seen any paper looking at the risk from that standpoint. And when people look at risk, we looked at them. Some are using 1960s Kenneth Arrow type reasoning, which of course is not, it's too primitive to allow us to make any conclusion. And when people say, "Where is the evidence?" Tell them, "Hey, what was the evidence that smoking could cause cancer? What was the evidence that lobotomy was bad? What was the evidence that Teldane, Triludan, Seldane, Ecotrin, Lipobay, Baycol, Distilbene, whatever, I don't know how to pronounce them, Vioxx, Ceox, Telodex, all the thalidomide things. Where was the evidence that these were harmful? Evidence showed up late. You see, sometimes even in one case across the generation. So you have a problem with the reasoning of people invoking evidence when they don't know what they're talking about as far as evidence. No statistician put a stamp that we have evidence that this is safe. They tell you failure to reject the melt at this percentage. And so they sort of agree with us that tail is not investigated. We haven't seen investigation of the tail that's properly done.
But as you point out in the paper, if you're not careful, you can invoke that for lots of things. And you're saying...
Exactly. So we are not invoking. For example, the nuclear, we cannot invoke the precautionary principle for the nuclear. You see? Why? Because the nuclear will stay local. It doesn't mean it's not risky. You see, you may want to ban nuclear for risk purpose, but the nuclear, you cannot have, a Fukushima cannot destroy, lead to destructions in India, or may in India, but not in Lebanon, you see? Or maybe Lebanon, but not Cyprus. So you don't have, but if you have now the same crops invading the whole planet, it's too much. Having GMOs on an island is one thing, and generalizing things to the planet in the name of science is another thing. And I've heard, listen, if I had, I told you, that was a Mexican peso, but if I had the Lebanese lira, right, or make it a Turkish lira, because now there's a lot of trading in Turkish lira action. If I had a Turkish lira every time, I heard people saying that we scientists with a zillion PhDs have, think that these securities are very safe. I'm saying people speaking, employed by Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, or Morgan Stanley in 2007 before the crisis. Okay, and they would say no, there's zero probability of a tail event. And even if you saw the Stiglitz-Orzag report about Fannie Mae,
oh yeah.
Okay, so where's the point is you have to deal with skepticism and the corner of the probability distribution, okay, unless you have some strong feeling that a very, very robust reasoning showing that this is not going to harm beyond that local unit.
Well, let me ask it a different way.
Yes.
I understand if you would, well, you said it in 2007. If you said, well, if the so-called PhD expert said it's been safe so far, you could have said, well, these things are all tied together. You could say that, oh, you have insurance, but every firm has insurance with AIG, and therefore when everybody goes broke, AIG is going to have a problem honoring their promises. So you could say that then. The question now I have is that where's the evidence that this GMO process is a fat tail process rather than a thin tail process?
The first thing you gotta, when you think of, are we in fat tail or thin tail domain, is look the other way and say, where's the evidence that we are in thin tail domain? See? Nature produces some thin tail, things under a process that it has to have some kind of balance and obeys a central limit. So, for example, within species, humans are, the height follows a Gaussian distribution. But nature doesn't deliver thin tails between species. Look at an elephant versus a mouse. Hey, this is a very fat-tailed process. Or the difference in size between a mammoth and a bacteria. So you have, and they're all life, okay, the same. Life is can take a lot of forms. So nature is effectively largely fat-tailed. And the way we define fat-tailed in a paper is rigorously as in a class we call sub-exponential class. So nature is fat-tailed. But why doesn't nature blow up since it's fat-tailed? Because effectively you have circuit breakers that transform the fat tails into what we call modified thin tails. You see what I mean?
Well, you're talking about an example of there could be extinction on an island. There could be an extinction on a continent.
Exactly.
There could be local. There could be ruin, but it's local ruin.
Exactly. So it stays local. So nature. So it's much healthier for people to default to fat tails and provide the evidence of thin-tailedness than the other one. And I wrote a paper that's a chapter in Silent Risk. I think it's chapter 4 now. But you know what happened. We keep adding chapters before. So the chapter
Silent Risk is a manuscript you're working on.
It's freely available on the web.
Right.
It has all the mathematical theorems and backup of these things, plus a lot of discussions of fat tails, how to calibrate fat tails.
And people who are intimidated by the math can open just to the beginning and see a cartoon of Nassim Taleb in a boat going over a enormous waterfall as he's saying "stop," and the people on the boat saying, "Oh, where's the evidence that anything's wrong with the boat?" et cetera, et cetera. So we'll put a link up to it. It's good browsing even for the non-mathematical.
Great. No, but the book is effectively a mathematization of the Inserto. Inserto is the 4 books I've written so far in the philosophical essays on uncertainty. And
the fourth one being the bed of Procrustes, which I did not mention in my introduction.
Exactly. So, but there's nothing in my in there that's not said verbally. And what I'm going to discuss now, instead of talking about the mathematical version, chapter 4 of Silent Risk, I can talk about what I called in a black swan, the masquerade problem. That you can always say the process is not thin-tailed. You cannot, with any confidence, say the process is not fat-tailed. Just from observation, simply because fat-tailed processes can masquerade as thin-tails, and that's a turkey problem.
And I feel bad. We should have made it clear because I forget that not everybody has been listening to EconTalk since 2006, but.
Yeah.
Thin tails means that the probability of remote events is very, 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 very vanishingly small, and fat tails means it's small but not zero. Is that a good summary?
It's a good summary. Another way to view it is not in probabilities but in consequences. If I gather 1,000 people randomly, invite them to an EconTalk episode to watch and weigh them, and then you have the total weight, and you add to that sample the largest human being on the planet. That person will not represent more than 0.3% of the total. You see, but if you do the same with wealth, you would have the total. You would be maybe because you have a lot of people, living on a few dollars a day on the planet, 7 billion people. Total population, you have at least 4 billion very poor people. So odds are you'll have maybe 1.5 million net worth for your sample. And then you add to that the richest person on the planet, $75 billion, and look what happens, right? There'd be a rounding error. So which means fat tail is how much the rare event contributes to the total properties. That's it.
Although I'd like to think Warren Buffett is an EconTalk listener. I don't know that he isn't. So, but go ahead.
So the idea of that's quite central in our work, in our paper, and also in the other parts of the Inserto, is that there is a clear demarcation between fat-tailed and thin-tails. You can identify thin-tails. You can tell if it's fat-tailed but that demarcation is one way. It's easier to say it's fat-tailed than thin-tailed, unless you have deep knowledge of the process.
And you make a distinction between a naive precautionary principle and a non-naive.
A naive precautionary principle would be paranoia. would be someone who would not cross the street because it's too much risk. Okay? And you cannot invoke the precautionary principle on these things for several reasons. The first one is that if you die, it's not the end of the world. It's not the worst possible thing. And not even for an individual. We're part of a species. We're part of a family. The worst case scenario for me is not my death. It's the death of me plus my close ones, plus my extended family, plus my village in Lebanon, plus the animals around me, plus humanity. So it's not the end. You have to say my death is not the end of the world. So that's the first thing. The second one is crossing the street is thin-tailed. In other words, the process has very well-known characteristics. It's 1 in 47,000 years, probability is very small of dying as a pedestrian. And it's not like I'm going to jump on a highway. And there's a difference between crossing the street and jumping, during at midday on 95, okay, on the highway.
Oh, and you give the example of crossing the street with a blindfold.
Exactly. Don't cross the blindfold. So a lot of people have invoked the precautionary principle and effectively debased it by using it and say, hey, let's invade Iraq. It's a precautionary principle. What we try to do is the exact opposite of what people thought we were doing, is we're not establishing the precautionary principle by adding to it, we're removing from it bad uses of the precautionary principle. And that was the initial intent of the paper.
So where are the good uses besides GMOs? You said nuclear energy is localized.
No. Nuclear energy is very risky. It's probably riskier than anything else, but it can be managed using risk management techniques. You see, it's not a precautionary principle. We understand.
What about global warming?
Precautionary principle. Because we only have one planet, one left tail, we only have one planet. We can't really afford to lose it. So I would say we have to exercise precaution there. Even if you only have a very small probability of harming, that the real cause may be carbon, even then, you have to play it safe.
Are there any other areas besides those two?
Well, we exercise a weak form, as I told you, the precautionary principle every day, but we exercise it in its local form. It becomes a local precautionary principle. You exercise it before people board a plane. When you go to the airport, they check you. They don't have any evidence that you're a terrorist. Why do they check you? It's unscientific. You go tell them it's unscientific. You see that you're a scientist. You can lecture them, and no. This probability of harm is very small, but the harm is quite consequential for you. So you're very happy that they're checking you and other passengers before you get on a plane. So you can exercise that very locally.
I think the challenge is, well, how much care should you take? I mean, it's
how much care should you take? Okay, so what we did is, at the level of society, we exercise the precautionary principle to defend citizens against people risking systemic ruin, where you have effectively a moral hazard coupled with that, where you have systemic ruin that may benefit Monsanto or some other firm and harm humanity. You need a principle like that to protect us, particularly that you have people are maybe using bad science or pseudoscience in a Hayekian sense.
So
to defend such use.
And what would be the right way? Again, talking to Greg Page of Cargill and knowing some people at Monsanto, they're very happy to be regulated. In fact, they're eager to be regulated because they feel that gives them both the stamp of approval for their customers. It makes their customers feel better. It often also can keep out competitors.
I'm not going to get into the details of what we should be doing because the list would be very long, but I'm quite nauseated at the behavior of these firms using lobbyists and a category of what I call lobbyists-scientists, unemployed scientists. And effectively, you also have in the biological community some kind of what should I say? A kind of their interests aren't the interest of you and I. If you're a biologist, it has been shown that if you go to a radiologist, You recommend radiation therapy, but if the surgeon recommends surgery for a simple cancer case, and the oncologist recommends chemotherapy. So people have a vested interest in using their discipline to solve a problem.
If I had a hammer, I'd look for a nail.
So it's the nail and hammer situation on the part of the biological community. So but what I find very nauseating is what I have seen by these large conglomerates in the approach because it's not just, couldn't care about GMO, but it's very small compared to the hijacking of science by scientism, and why 60 years after Hayek approached the problem, and 40 some years after his Nobel Prize, the pretense of knowledge, we are now committing things that are a lot worse than we did before in the name of science. And this is what bothers me, and these approaches, you see?
Well, we're more confident.
Yeah. So
mistakenly confident.
Let me tell you what bothers me even more. So I made that thin-tail, fat-tailed comparison by showing that consequences may be very large in a fat-tailed domain, so you have to be more cautious. Now, a bunch of psychologists have been invoking irrationality. Saying, hey, people are irrational. And you look at what they're basing the claims on, and you notice that, hey, they're using a probability distribution, and they say, well, there's something, we've read in some paper, there's a long shot bias that people overestimate small probabilities. Therefore, people are irrational, here. This is nonsense. This is kind of nonsense committed by Cass Sunstein, but by other people as well, pathologizing people who worry because, hey, how did we get here? It pays to be paranoid. You actually have to be paranoid.
Yeah,
And also, when you change their model, when you look at their model, they don't know the fat-tailed exists. So if you use a fat-tailed model, hey, it becomes very rational to worry about these things. You see, it is very irrational to worry about sharks in San Diego when the probability is very low, or to worry about crossing the street. That's paranoia. And like, for example, also worrying about flying versus driving. It is paranoia. It's very irrational. I agree with the psychologist for sure on that. But it's not irrational to worry about terrorism or Ebola or things that have a fat tail.
Yeah, I want to take let me try to restate that, because I've always, like you, found that perplexing. You're nauseated. I'm perplexed. But the example that people often say in this literature is that people overestimate the riskiness of some process. And what they mean by that, I think, is that they don't follow the expected value. And my thought is, why would it be rational for an individual to use the expected value for precisely the reason you talk about, which is that it's true that if the expected value, if I played the game 1,000,000 times, the expected value is going to be, say, positive. But if I play it once and I'm dead, that's a bad game. I don't want to play that game. I don't get that.
This reminds me of another conflation that people make in their minds, is that improving returns with lower risk. So if you're picking up pennies in front of a steamroller, you're probably, in all odds, you're going to end up in a cemetery. You agree?
Yeah.
But the probability of dying isn't going to change whether you're picking pennies or dollars.
Correct. Just a question of when.
Yeah, exactly. So it's the same. Nothing changes whether you're picking up pennies, dollars, or $100 bills.
Right. Okay? It's a fast steamroller, and you're right. Oh, but they're $1,000. They're $1,000 bills.
Exactly.
Yeah, but you're still preoccupied with picking it up. Means that you're going to get rolled over sometimes. You should probably not. You should get out of the way.
Yeah. So let me get mathematical 1 second, because this paper is the hardest, has been the hardest for me to communicate with your audience, because it's fundamentally mathematical, and we're being verbalistic here. But there's something about the probability distribution that if you're very often, this is why I like to invoke precaution principle in some cases where people want to improve using something more complex, too complex for the situation itself. The left tail reacts vastly more to the scale of the distribution, which for a Gaussian or log normal would be the sigma, the standard deviation. But what we call the scale is more general for include distribution that don't have a variance, the ones I usually work with. So the left tail reacts more to the scale than to the mean of the distribution. And the more you go in the left tail, the more it reacts to the scale and less it reacts to the mean. You see? So what your risk of ruin may increase when you suggest a more favorable approach, which is why I worry about geoengineering. So if you worry just about the risk of ruin, improvement, any improvement that, because it doesn't have a track record, brings some uncertainty into the system, increases that risk of ruin. And we have to be very careful.
Well, and I want to just make sure we get this point in, which you mentioned in the paper, and it came up in the previous episode with Greg Page, which is, some people say, but if we don't try this, we face a different kind of ruin because we're all going to starve to death. And that's absurd. That's
beyond absurd. That's beyond absurd. So what I call the Russian roulette fallacy. Say, my family is going to starve if I don't play Russian roulette. All right. Well, it's going to starve more if you die. You see. So the Russian, but a lot of people invoke it, and then we give it a different name. We call it the technological salvation fallacy. And mathematized, it looks very clear, but in words, it doesn't strike people. But they're coming up with this idea of a GMOs is called golden rice. Okay, tell them what's the problem? Well, there's a problem of vitamin whatever
deficiency.
Vitamin. Yeah. So whatever vitamin A, C, whatever you want. So tell them, okay, we'll give them vitamins. You see, okay. No, this is bad. It's not better because it's more technological. The more complicated your answer, the more uncertainty you bring into the system. So you may be doing something cheaper and so on. Another element. I mean, this is quite critical to realize that the discourse on GMO is of an inferior quality than the one we had in finance. You see, so when we're arguing about the risk of these securities, the people on the other side of my skepticism and that of my peers were vastly more sophisticated than the people on GMOs. You see. Because they don't realize, hey, you know what? If you want to solve hunger, hey, just stop the biofuel nonsense. You see?
Yeah,
it is to try to solve hunger by solving hunger. Don't try to solve hunger by creating the technology that has still unknown, and I repeat, still unknown, unintended consequences.
But I want to come back to your point about in the case of how the increase in the benefit can actually be part of the problem. People would say, well, we need this global financial system. We need these derivatives because the benefits are so large. Or in the case of GMOs, we need this technology because it feeds the world. The problem is that globalization part, that systemic part, is potentially the source of the ruin.
Exactly. But we have to realize that, and that again, hence Hayekian, to follow the logic of a system in the way it has managed its own problems in the past. We believe there's something called a naturalistic fallacy, appeal to nature and stuff like that. But it's in the moral domain, but in the risk management domain, nature, unfortunately, is still much smarter than humans. It has much longer track record. And as scientists, we've got to go by the track record. Let me mention a couple of things here because I've got to talk about my co-authors, not just me. So let me go through the list of co-authors.
And before you do, Nassim, I just want to mention that you mentioned that this paper is difficult to talk about verbally because it's so mathematical. I want to tell listeners, we'll put a link up to it. It's actually all the math's in the appendices. There's a few charts and statistical distributions in the paper itself, but most of the paper is very accessible, and I encourage people to go to read it and check it out. But go ahead.
Yeah, no, it's important. Yeah, the backup is nonverbal. The math. Yeah, somehow we expressed in words the math, but it's backed up by the math. And I discovered one thing that's effectively chapter 1 now of Silent Risk is that when you talk in a verbalistic way about risk, you make a lot of mistakes.
Sure.
Well, risk can only be discussed mathematically because, as we mentioned, what is risk? Is it a tail risk? Is it a risk of variation? Is it a risk of making money? No. So is it variance? Is it tail alpha? Is it tail exponent? What is it? Okay. Is it right tail, left? So mathematically things become much cleaner. And then you realize once you put things down mathematically and you map payoffs, as I did in chapter 1, is that very often it's very rational to worry about some things and very irrational to worry about others, which is the exact opposite of what claims are made in the literature. The psychology, rationalization literature, decision science literature, which is still in its infancy and based on thin tail thinking.
So do you want to say anything about your co-authors?
Yeah, my co-authors. Okay, so
I did mention them at the beginning, but you can mention them again.
You mentioned them. Let me give the background, okay? Because Yanir Bar-Yam is a physicist, but complexity physicist by origin, but has published zillions of papers in molecular biology, and Joseph Norman is a biologist now doing, working on mathematizing biological systems. Raphael Douadi is my co-author in 2 other papers, particularly the one on fragility, is a mathematician, and he's there because of his knowledge of dynamical systems. He speaks Russian, which is very important. We wanted someone who knows dynamical system and knows the Russian rigor in it, you see. And Rupert Reed is a professor of philosophy, and of course, very, very versed in decision science and what is rationality, what is not irrationality. And then yours truly, I define myself principally as someone who deals with left tail risk. That's it.
Well, Nassim, you're just a flaneur. We know that.
I've done so much. You see, every year I start the year with, hey, what do I want to do this year? And the more I tell myself I want to take it easy, do flaneuring, the more I end up doing mathematics and no flaneuring. So my resolutions are not, are going in the opposite direction. It's very strange. When you don't have any pressure to do anything, that's when you do the work that is in you, that wants to come out and is now unfettered.
A paradox. Let's close with the following question. It's very hard to stop human initiative and innovation. So cloning, for example, at the human level, has unknown consequences for our culture, civilization. We had a recent episode here about superintelligence. We had a couple, actually, people who were worried about smart machines, whether that could have, I think you could certainly invoke potentially the precautionary principle there. And one view says, well, these are all interesting things to worry about, but they're almost impossible to stop.
No. Let me stop here 1 second. All right. Yeah. All these are peanuts. All right. Artificial intelligence is peanuts compared to dealing with ecosystem. You see, this is why we worried about GMO is a clear cut. We hear a lot of big names worrying about artificial intelligence. It's not a big deal, because artificial intelligence, it may be risky, but what I'm saying is that it's not the same scale as harming irreversibly the ecosystem.
Well, some people think it is. Some people think it's going to turn us into...
This I agree. This is why we put down the precautionary principle, okay? I'm not worried about antibiotics because, it may harm some people. They don't multiply, okay? It changed probably the flora in your organism. That's fine. It won't change the planet, right? We worry about a lot of things. No, our precautionary principle, okay, is confined to what can really lead to ecocides or destruction of life on the planet beyond humans.
But come back to my point, which is in all these areas, whether they're worrisome or not, and of course there are many things that fall short of ruin that are still very unpleasant.
I think we'll be able to stop soon enough with these. This is why. Let's continue with artificial intelligence. If it gets alarming, you can stop. This is not a thing where you put the switch on, you can't put it back.
My question is a cultural question, not a engineering question. It's very hard to put public policy in place that will stop people from making machines smarter, from making genetic innovation, from cloning human beings. Do you think there's any chance that we're going to be cautious in this area? Given your warnings?
if it weren't for lobbies of Monsanto, we'd be very cautious of GMOs. See, the FDA, but they come up with this argument with the FDA, it's the same thing as a tomato, therefore it doesn't need regulation. But the FDA has effectively slowed down, human aggressiveness in many areas. So we have been in the past able to curtail foolish scientism. We have stopped snake oil salespeople. We have stopped people from harming others in many domains. Can we stop technology? We should not stop technology innovation. In our paper, and our paper is meant to precisely stop the paranoia.
But is it a second question would be, is it too late? I think you say 90% of the corn in the United States is genetically modified.
That's the problem is never too late. You have to do something. But you will have, whether it's too late or not too late, we have to do something. And in the second version of the paper, we're discovering even things that are more alarming from reports in Switzerland. And Switzerland doesn't have GMOs. But nature is smart. But again, we don't have a lot of time to stop monsters from taking place. We should act on GMOs. But again, the gist of our paper is not to curtail risk-taking, but to remove the paranoia from some classes of risk-taking, to help, because effectively, to help people innovate. You see, husbandry, agriculture, there were local things, technology revolution, they're local things, and all this is reversible. See, we are reversing the bad effect of technology in many places. Pollution, you pollute rivers, you can reverse a little bit, okay? You cannot reverse what is generalized.
My guest today has been Nassim Nicholas Taleb. Nassim, thanks as always for being part of EconTalk.
Great, thank you very much. Thanks, Ross. Thanks once again.
This is EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. For more EconTalk, go to econtalk.org, where you can also comment on today's podcast and find links and readings related to today's conversation. The sound engineer for EconTalk is Rich Goyette. I'm your host, Russ Roberts. Thanks for listening. Talk to you on Monday.